My name is Eric. I'm working as disaster risk reduction specialist in the UNICEF regional office in Bangkok, covering both Asia and Pacific. During the next half an hour, I'll try to give an introduction to disaster risk reduction, and hopefully it will be good for you to see these slides, and if we are lucky, then get a bit of inspiration for how to take DRR forward in child protection. At the end of my presentation, my colleague, Annette Litt, who is our child protection in emergency specialist, she will elaborate more on the relevance of the slides to child protection. Let's go to the first slide. Basically, what I discovered when I joined UNICEF was that there were some misconceptions out there about what was disaster risk reduction. One of them we could call nothing new under the sun, and basically that was the idea that essentially there was nothing new in disaster risk reduction. It was more or less the same as the old emergency preparedness stuff that we have been doing all the time. The extreme opposite notion was that we could say that, okay, it's fine, disaster risk reduction is indeed new. So if we are talking of reducing risk, we could actually say that all development activities are in principle disaster risk reduction activities. And that would then mean that, say, all development, more or less everything that UNICEF does, is disaster risk reduction. And that fallacy we could call the emperor's new clothes. What I'm trying to argue in this presentation is that none of these notions or perceptions of DRR are correct, and instead we have to look at something different. Let's look a little bit at, say, the scenario in Asia Pacific. I think it's pretty well known by now that both disaster risk and climate change are increasing. So in many ways we know we will have more disasters, they will be more severe, and they will be more unpredictable in the future. The good news is, and there is some good news, and that is basically that what we could call the case fatality rate, or say the number of deaths per event, is actually reducing, especially when we look at weather-related events. And that means that instead of in the good old days where it was very much a question of survival and ensuring that people were alive after a disaster, now it's much more becoming a livelihood issue. Exactly because it's becoming a livelihood issue, there is a close link from disaster risk reduction to development. Second point that I want to make in this slide is also that we have to remember that Asia's population is young. If we look at typical most of the countries in our region, we would know that, say, between 1/3 and half of the population are below 18 years. And that actually means that it's very relevant for us to look at how disaster risk reduction relates to children. We also know that if we look at, say, the casualties of disasters, we know that children are disproportionately affected. Typically they will present maybe like 50–60%, and that means that this is just another encouragement for us to do something about children and disaster risk reduction. The third point that I want to make on this slide is also that if we look at a generational issue, actually the most of us who are adults, we are not going to feel the full force of climate change, but we know for sure that children will. And that means because of this we have an intergenerational issue here, and there's even a rights argument for children to get involved in these issues. So this was basically just a little bit about the scenario in Asia Pacific. On the next slide, I will try to highlight a few key issues that we have discussed within our emergency unit. First of all is if we sort of look at ASEAN, the region here where we have very strong governments, maybe the solution that we come up with, the humanitarian cluster approach, is not really the best solution. Maybe we should try to rethink it, and I guess that is somehow going on with the transformative agenda. But this is one thing we want to highlight, that the humanitarian cluster system is good, but maybe not appropriate in this context, and certainly not in all disasters. Second point is also that we know for sure we have these big cities coming up all over Asia, and there are very specific problems about doing urban risk management. We saw it in Haiti with the big earthquake, and we are seeing it in a number of other scenarios around the region and the world. So we need to do specific efforts to actually address urban risk management. The third issue we could highlight is the whole issue of, if we look at, say, where we have poor performance of MDGs, and we look at, say, where we have most disasters, there's a clear correlation between the two. And that is why we have come to the conclusion that we need to actually disaster-proof the MDGs. And by that, we basically mean we want to mainstream emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction, and climate change into both the emergency programming and also the development programming. A very smart way of saying it is that emergency programming should become less shock-driven and more vulnerability-driven. And if we then look at the development programming or planning, we are saying that it should no longer be blind, but instead we need to get disaster risk and climate change into the thinking. I'm going to stop here about sort of putting the DRR slides into the regional perspective, and then instead continue with just giving a very brief overview of disaster risk reduction and also climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. Next. If we look at these two pictures, and actually this is a quite famous slide because nobody really knows where it originates from. I saw it first time in a PowerPoint presentation maybe 10 years ago. What we have done now is just we have put a bit more colors on the pictures. But the point of the slide is quite easy to understand. What we have on the drawing on top is basically a village in 1961, and then on the drawing below we have a village, say, nowadays. And of course, the point of the two drawings is basically to say that on the first drawing on top we have got less population density, and on the one down we have got high population density. At the same time, we've got a number of factors going on. We have poverty, we may have erosion, we have landslides, we have pollution, a lot of things going on that basically makes the point that, say, disasters are not only a question of hazards affecting a certain area, but also of the vulnerability and the exposure that relates to that. So what we're saying is, if you have an earthquake in the drawing on top and an earthquake on the drawing below, there will be dramatically different consequences. And that is basically because we have different settings and we have different development impacts. On the next slide, I'm kind of showing how we used to think of disaster management. And maybe most of you have seen this disaster cycle. And that was it is one way of thinking that is quite dominating in the disaster management field. The point of this slide is basically showing that if we look at, say, how the scenario was in the 1970s, it was quite typical that we only got involved in this after an event happened. So we would have like a major disaster. Think of, for instance, the Bangladesh cyclone in 1971, 500,000 people dead. And then after that event, we would start thinking about how to respond in the best way. This we could kind of say is the paradigm of the 70s. In the 1980s, it became clear to most of us that we need to have people working on disaster management all the time. So if they're not responding, then they will be involved in preparedness. And that is really where we got this notion of the cycle, where we have permanent staff working on these issues. We could argue that in most contexts, it is probably still how emergency units they function. But if we look at the next slide, we will see what's coming up with disaster risk reduction. And really, the new thinking of disaster risk reduction is to try to break the logic of the recurring disasters. And we want to do that by investing our time, energy, commitment in working more on mitigation and prevention. And mitigation and prevention are really the key words for disaster risk reduction, and they also relate to development. And that is why we have to think of disaster risk reduction as a bridge between emergency and development interventions. On the next slide, you will see that we have a typical illustration of what we could call disaster-prone development. We have a scenario where basically we have recurring disasters that will force development planners to sort of not achieve their objectives, and then we have new accumulation of risk that will lead to new disasters. This is how it goes on if we don't take disaster risk reduction into consideration in our development thinking. The type of studies that sort of correlate to this way of thinking is that we would look at disasters, and then we would look at how disasters impact child survival, development, and rights. And there's been a number of studies highlighting how children are disproportionately affected by these disasters, but in itself there are not so many new conclusions coming up of that approach. Instead, what we would like to see, and this is shown on the next slide, is that we would like to see disaster in risk-informed development. And in here we have got a different logic. Basically, we are saying if we do sustainable development, if we ensure that we are not creating new risk by doing our development interventions, then we will have the capacity to do appropriate response, and that will in itself also contribute to risk reduction. So this is really where we want to go, and unfortunately it is not where we are right now. If we then look at our child survival, development, and rights, then instead of looking at children as vulnerable individuals, here we are instead trying to see how we can make children empowered citizens who can contribute to risk reduction. So we are redefining children as being having lots of capacities, and also being able to contribute to come up with solutions for the future. And that is the vision, and that is where we would like to go with our child-centered disaster risk reduction. On the next slide, you will see a bit more about the logic of disaster risk reduction. Basically, it relates to a formula that was invented long ago, but this formula is very important in order to understand where we come from and what is new in this thinking. Basically, the starting point is we are saying we don't want to use the terms natural disasters anymore, because we don't think there's anything natural about disasters. There might be natural hazards, but there are no natural disasters. Disasters in itself is actually a product of wrong development choices. So that is sort of the one notion of the formula. The second notion is also that we are not focusing on disasters, but we are instead focusing on risk. And risk, in our understanding, is a disaster that hasn't happened yet. And yet we know we use the risk notion for a number of different understandings or concepts. But in our way of thinking, it relates to the formula that you have there on the screen. Basically saying that risk is a product of hazards multiplied by vulnerability, multiplied by exposure, and then you have what's countering it is the capacity aspect. Sometimes if we look at hazards, we can say we have man-made hazards and we have natural hazards. We may not always be able to affect them. For instance, seismic hazards, we can't do anything about them, we will have to live with them. But if we talk of, for instance, flooding, we can indeed do something about reducing the hazards, and man-made hazards we can also reduce. But hazards is only one aspect of the equation, and that is why we can now say that what's more important is really focusing on the vulnerability and the capacity. Most of the things that UNICEF does in the regular programs actually relates to reducing vulnerabilities and enhancing capacities. So by working on vulnerability and capacity, we can reduce the risk, and we can thereby contribute to disaster risk reduction. The last part of the formula is focusing on exposure. And exposure is basically there because it's also an issue of, say, population density and population numbers. We know if we have a lot of people, children, involved, obviously the consequences will be worse. So what we are trying to say with this risk formula is really that it is not earthquakes that kill people, but it is collapsing buildings and lack of poor urban planning. So think about this formula. It might actually be very helpful in understanding why we have dramatically different consequences of natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, in, say, the developed countries and the developing countries. On the next slide, I just want to show you a scenario from the flooding we had in Bangkok half a year ago. And this is basically a map showing how the flooding impacted the city and the city center. And as you will see, there's absolutely nothing natural about this scenario. It starts pretty natural. In that sense, you have rain falling in the mountains. It goes down from the mountains through the plains, and then it wants to get out in the ocean. But at the same time, you see that the city center is not at all impacted. And this is obviously because we had proper flood management. We had a lot of political decisions going on, basically ensuring that the city center would not be impacted by disasters. And the message that we want to convey with this slide is basically that think about most natural disasters as not natural at all. They are actually the product of political decisions and also the product of inaction. Same message comes through on the next two slides. It basically shows vulnerability, again from the Thailand flood. On this slide you will have here housing, and these houses are better off than on the next slide, where you will see another type of housing. Typically the poor people would live in situations like this, and the point here is that we will see that disasters in the future become much more a question of your socioeconomic status. Basically, if you're rich, well off, you can escape. If you're poor and you don't have financial resources, you are going to be the main victim of disaster events. And I think these two photos kind of make that point. It was also, if you look at the next slide, this is from Bangkok Post, and there you will see that this was also illustrated actually during the flood by one of the drawings in the newspaper, saying that traditionally, if we look at, say, how old Thai houses were, they were actually quite strong and they had the capacity to withstand flooding. But with our new lifestyle, we are actually creating a lot of vulnerabilities, and that means that our whole community, our whole society is much more exposed to disaster events, and we are much more affected. And this is again one illustration of why disasters and disaster risk reduction has become more important nowadays. If we then, on the next slide, try to look at a bit more of a regional perspective, this is basically a map showing the relative economic exposure to risk. And that means on this map here we have got sort of a relative measure of how economies of various countries are exposed to disaster risk. And what you will see on this map is obviously that Asia Pacific is very severely affected, and there's no surprise that you have Philippines, you have Myanmar, you have Bangladesh very high on the list, and basically the whole region is highly exposed to disaster risk. And that basically means that we have to take this serious and we have to sort of integrate it into our programs. On the next slide, again, this is one way of sort of illustrating where we want to go. That is basically again showing two towns, villages, and instead of the good old days, here we are seeing the bright future. So the idea is that we want to get to a type of society where we are ensuring that we will have reduced the risk. And this is of course illustrated in the illustration below. There's one key document in disaster risk reduction called the Hyogo Framework for Action. And this is one thing that's very important for all of us to know. And this document has 5 priority actions, and basically saying that what we used to understand as disaster management is only 1 out of 5 priority actions. What we are trying to refocus on in disaster risk reduction is also raising the importance of disaster risk reduction as a political issue, and also assessing risk and addressing the underlying risk factors. And you will see that this is actually on the agenda for the first 4 of the priority actions. Only the 5th one is focusing on traditional disaster management. So based on the Hyogo framework, the question is then how we address this disaster risk management. The new thing is, before we used to only prepare for emergencies, but what we are saying now is there are other options. We can reduce disaster risk and we can also transfer disaster risk. So whereas in the good old days we did contingency planning, we built scenarios, and then we prepared for event in order to ensure that we would minimize the consequences. Nowadays, we have another option, and that other option is we can actually invest in what we could call risk reduction. Think of it like that. If you have Kathmandu, capital city of Nepal, and you know every day you have 500,000 of kids going to schools that can collapse in a second in an earthquake, it does not actually make sense to invest in emergency preparedness. It's much more important for an organization as UNICEF to go in and do advocacy for safe schools. It is not only the morally the right issue to do, but it is also highly cost effective, and this is the only way we can sort of cope with future disaster scenarios. So what we are saying now is we do still want to understand how natural and man-made hazards impact us, development, emergency planning, but instead of only focusing on preparedness, now we also want to open up the option that we can actually invest in risk reduction, and we can do something about reducing the risk. On my next slide, if we then look at the common DRR terminology, the new issue is really, before we used to concentrate on response and preparedness, and this is what we can call disaster management. The new thing that are coming into the picture with disaster risk reduction is mitigation and prevention. This is what we could call full-fledged disaster risk reduction. And both disaster management and disaster risk reduction, that is what sometimes is called disaster risk management. And typically, if you see some government documents, if you see UNDP documents, if you see documents from the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, you will see that they use the notion disaster risk management. And by using that little risk word, it makes a lot of difference for people who are in the disaster risk reduction field, and they will know that they have become informed by the new approach. On my next slide, I'm kind of illustrating climate change, because we also know that climate change is likely to actually increase the number of extreme climate events that we are likely to face in the future. So here again, look at the regions that are most affected. Exactly like before, where we looked at the economic exposure, here also when we look at the climate change vulnerability, we will see that Asia Pacific is highly exposed, and that this is the region where we have a lot of climate change vulnerability. And that means that in the next 20 years, we are likely to see much more weather-related disasters coming up. So the deeper question is, if we don't change our approach from preparedness and response, we are going to be very, very busy in the future. On the next, I'm illustrating the climate change adaptation concept and how it overlaps with disaster risk reduction. Still, many times in UNICEF, climate change is seen as an environmental issue, and it basically only relates to sort of reducing the emission of greenhouse gases. But it is no longer like that. Climate change has now become a fundamental development issue, and instead of only looking at how we can reduce the greenhouse gases, we are now also increasingly focusing on how can we adapt our societies to a future scenario where we will have increased temperatures and increased sea level, etc. And this is what we call climate change adaptation. And if you look at the climate change adaptation, then it is actually more or less the same as disaster risk reduction. And that is why nowadays a lot of people will focus on disaster risk reduction as one key intervention that contributes to climate change adaptation. It all depends on the context of the planning of the interventions. Obviously, if we are in the Pacific Islands or if we are in Maldives, climate change will be the key issue to address, whereas if we are in other scenarios like maybe Pakistan, maybe Afghanistan, maybe Nepal, it is the planning and the whole, the key issue is really disaster risk reduction in that setting. So basically what we are saying is, we are saying disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, they overlap, and we can actually work on disaster risk reduction both as a way of addressing disaster risk, but also as a climate change adaptation measure. On the next few slides, I just have illustrations, and this is again from the Thai flooding, basically show an example of adaptation, of extreme climate change adaptation, and even resilience. This is of course not the preferred way that we would like to reduce risk, but it is nevertheless quite impressive that you have a family sitting there watching TV and you have maybe 10 centimeters of water inside the house. Think of how many houses in the Western world would be able to cope with the water in that way. It is actually quite impressive. On the next slide, we have one of these photos that actually illustrate very well what's happening nowadays with the disaster risk reduction agenda. The point was that we looked at it before was basically that say it is not so much a question of life and death anymore, but disasters has much more become an issue of livelihood. And basically this guy swimming there is smart enough to sort of ensure that his money are dry and he can probably go to the market and buy some stuff he needs. So again, an extreme example of resilience, not our preferred solution, but something to think about in order to understand what disaster risk reduction is and how it works. On the next slide, I'm just going to show 4 slides that basically will illustrate what we understand with child-centred DRR. And for UNICEF, it is very important to focus on this concept because obviously we need to bring children into our discussion and on our understanding of disaster risk reduction. First of all, we could ask, why are we actually focusing on the child-centred DRR? As we have previously seen, there's the whole demographic argument. We know that Asia's population is young and vulnerable, and we know that it's children who will feel the full force of climate change. For this reason, we have a strong demographic argument to actually go in and look at this concept. The second thing is the child rights argument. It's possible to actually look and map down how disaster risk and how climate change impacts child rights, and we will see there are lots of links. So obviously, by going in and working on reducing risk and adapting to climate, we will also be able to actually contribute to ensuring that child rights are safeguarded. The third argument I want to highlight is we have lots and lots of high-level policy support in this region to the notion of child-centered disaster risk reduction, and even globally there's an increasing interest in the notion of child-centered approaches to DRR and climate change. And this is something we are working on in partnership with Save the Children and Plan International, World Vision, and the International Development Studies at the University of Sussex. One thing that I want to highlight about child-centered DRR is basically the whole issue of swimming. We were approached by some of our partners a few months back whether we wanted to do a global campaign on swimming. And we thought about it for a long time, and obviously swimming is a key issue for children to be able to do. But when we also thought about the fact that child-centered DRR are not always understood in the right way, we kind of decided that we don't think it's a smart solution to just go out and promote swimming as child-centered disaster risk reduction. Because one of the key issues in disaster risk reduction is we need to have a good link between what we could call risk identification and then the strategies to sort of address them. So obviously swimming is a fantastic thing to do if you are in a setting where the hazards are flooding, especially flash flood maybe, but in other settings it may not be appropriate. Instead, if we want to understand children's role, it is possible to look at them as having 4 roles. We are saying basically they are very good at analyzing risk and also identifying risk reduction activities. And they are very good at also designing and implementing disaster risk reduction, especially at the community level, because children actually have very good skills in understanding and identifying these issues. And also they're very good at actually communicating risk, especially when it comes to peers and also when it's in relation to the families. Children are very powerful in conveying messages. And then what we sometimes have exploited at the international level is to use children as mobilization of resources, and this is also one thing we could think about exploiting a bit more at the community level and at the national level. The last slide I want to show on the child-centered DRR is basically a mind map that is made by a 9-year-old girl, and in many ways it is quite impressive because it really shows a quite sophisticated understanding of climate change, and it is very powerful to have these drawings and it is very effective to actually have children present these drawings to community members, to politicians, and then have them ask politicians, what are you doing to actually ensure that my future is going to be safe, and what do you do to address these key issues? So drawing competitions are fantastic, and especially also at regional events, because it's one way of sort of overcoming translation issues. I'm almost done by my slides. I just want to now instead show one example about what we are doing in UNICEF to address child-centred DRR. The first thing about why do we need to bother about disaster risk reduction and climate change. I think it has already been illustrated that women are vulnerable, disproportionately affected. That's the first point. Second point is that we have now the occurrence of mega disasters, big events like the Haiti earthquake, the Pakistan flood, and that is actually showing that we need to rethink this. We can no longer just continue responding as we have done, because then we are going to be overwhelmed in the future. And then the third argument we could say is that we know for sure that disasters slow down the progress towards achieving the MDGs. So for this reason, we are saying development as usual is no longer acceptable, and it becomes therefore interesting to think about how we can integrate these issues into your regular work. The challenges we have in UNICEF are basically that we tend to operate in silos, and we have plenty of silos in UNICEF. We have silos between development and emergencies. We find that they are increasingly counterproductive. We have also got the sectorial approach, which has a number of limitations, because really if you want to do good programming, we need to actually work much more on convergence, and if you want to reduce child risk in a given community, we need to have multi-sectorial approaches. Child protection is an important issue, but it has to be seen in it has to be seen in connection with other interventions by other sectors. What we're also seeing is that prefabricated interventions are very quick, but they're not always appropriate and cost-effective. And sometimes, actually, when we address these issues in Asia Pacific, we experience that governments are better performed than we are. So it is quite imperative for us to kind of catch up with these debates and better understand how we can contribute to this new agenda that's coming up internationally. One of the issues we have done in UNICEF related to that is actually trying to develop guidance notes. And in these guidance notes we have come up with here in Asia Pacific, we have identified 7 multi-sectorial approaches and 5 sectorial approaches. And these guidance notes, I'm sure they will also be available on the community of practice, and you can have a look at them there. What we are seeing is that at some policy documents, and we have actually disaster risk reduction being incorporated. Philippines have done it, and actually also Afghanistan and Pakistan are working on it right now. India has done it too. So it is actually going on also at the policy level. Then one thing that I will illustrate on my next slide is really the whole issue of doing child-centered risk assessment, because we think that it's a very promising way forward, and that I will return to in my next slide. But we also have, and let's not forget, in education we have a very solid disaster risk reduction approach, and we also have a focus going on in UNICEF now on water and climate change. So, and also not to forget that there's a number of good community-based interventions going on in the field that also contribute to this. And the last thing I want to highlight on this slide is basically the whole climate change impact studies that has been done in East Asia Pacific. So it is not that UNICEF is not engaged in this discussion. It is maybe more an issue of the fact that we have a number of different interventions in different fields, and we do not always link them well together. Let me return to the issue of the child-centered risk assessment. In order to understand what that is about, I just want to show you the example from the Nepal country office. And basically, the issue is there that they have recently come up with a new country program, and in order to target their child interventions in the future, they have come up with what they call the child vulnerability assessment. Actually, they call it a child deprivation index, But in our analysis, it is exactly what we could call child vulnerability. What they're doing in this analysis is they look at 8 indicators from different sectors, and then they try to quantify child vulnerability. And by doing that, they will typically come up with some parts of the country where they have to engage. On this map, you will see they have darker colors, and then they will give less attention to the lighter colors. This is a kind of typical way of doing development interventions, and in itself, this is not really a disaster risk-informed way of targeting, but this is the starting point. On the next slide, you have got what we could call a multi-hazard risk assessment. It's basically showing a map of the country and showing how 6 different types of hazards are impacting the country. And again, there's a sort of a methodology here for quantifying where you have most hazards impacting individual districts. So this in itself has nothing to do with development, but this has everything to do with doing targeting for future emergency interventions. So this is what we typically call the multi-hazard risk assessment. What we then tried to do with the Nepal country office was basically overlaying the data from the child vulnerability assessment with the multi-hazard risk assessment. And that is coming up on the next slide, where you will see this is actually the result. And if you remember the formula we had on a previous slide, it is exactly what the formulas say. We are here overlaying hazards with vulnerability in order to better understand child risk. The interesting thing about this slide is, if, for instance, UNDP would do this analysis, they would focus on, for instance, GDP per square kilometer, and then they would come up with different parts of the country where they would engage. Their analysis give much higher attention to urban centers, because that is where you have GDP per square kilometer concentrated. By our analysis, we have a different geographical focus, and that means that we have to engage on these issues in other parts of the country, and this is exactly where we get the child-centered assessment, and this is where we get the child focus. Bear in mind, and here I'm also just thinking of child protection, it does not mean that urban areas are not important, but it is a tool to kind of distinguish some areas where we want to engage, and maybe we need to think of doing this risk assessment in a different way in order to capture child vulnerability related to protection. So based on this risk assessment, what they then did in Nepal was basically saying, okay, now we have revealed the risk, we have mapped them out, now we need to think about how can we redefine our interventions. And what we say is basically based on this risk assessment, we go back to you, program staff, and ask you, what can you do differently in terms of these 5 parameters we have outlined there. We say you can change your geographical area. We say you can change the timing of interventions. We say you could look at specific target groups. You can, for instance, change the program approach, or you could actually also come up with different activities to ensure that you reach out to the most vulnerable groups. So these are just 5 broad ideas that will help us actually convert the child-centered risk assessment into action, into future actions that will contribute to disaster risk reduction. What I typically do when I visit country offices is basically saying to each section, please come up with at least 3 actions you will do differently based on the child-centered risk assessment and based on this slide, and then these actions will then contribute to a country office analysis of and strategy of disaster risk reduction. I think here I would like to end my section of the slides and then give the floor to Annette, who's going to actually elaborate a little bit more on the relevance for child protection and how she sees that it relates to the work that she's doing.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, so let's look at what does this mean? What does DRR mean for our work in child protection? Next slide, please. Well, first, let's just remind ourselves about the definition of child protection. The definition of child protection in emergencies is the protection of children from violence, abuse, and exploitation and neglect in emergencies. So you can see already from this definition that most of these protection risks will actually happen in the aftermath of the emergency and not maybe directly linked to the emergency itself. And that, of course, affects the way how we see DRR and child protection. Next slide, please. But it's also very interesting to combine the notions of the two concepts of disaster risk reduction and child protection, because it provides us with a platform to merge human rights perspective with a development approach in a way so that we better can understand how to capacitate children, which in this case are the right holders, to claim their rights, as well as developing the capacity of the duty bearers on all levels. Next slide, please. I would also like to touch upon two important concepts in child protection before we go in more and looking at how this, what this means for DRR and child protection. But a very important concept is the protective environment around children. As you can see in this picture, UNICEF has distinguished 8 different components as being important to provide a protective environment around children. One is the commitment from government that they put in place the right policies, the funding for child protection, that you have the right legislation in place, that the attitudes in society towards children recognizes children as individuals with rights and with capacities, that there is an open discussion about the problems and issues that concerns children, that children have life skills so that they are that they can protect themselves, that there is a capacity of community and family to protect children and to take care of vulnerable children or children at risk, that there are essential services available for children that need them and rehabilitation for children who have been abused, that there is monitoring and reporting in place so that we know the situation for children and also where the gaps and where there is need for action. And if you look at these circles in these 8 different components, you can clearly see what an emergency can do to this environment. So even if you have all these components in place in normal times, there's a great risk that an emergency will affect the environment in different ways. And that's what we need to think about when we think about disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. Another linked and very important concept is the concept of child protection systems. We're increasingly moving away from issue-based child protection, which before was tended to look at different issues or problems in isolation, maybe, for example, street children or gender inequality. Instead, we're today trying to look at systems, putting systems in place that work with all children that are risk and vulnerable, and so that we're putting one system in place that can address the vulnerabilities and risks for a bigger number of children. So one way of defining a child protection system is to look at it as a series of components, for example, laws, policies, regulations, services, that are organized around the goal of preventing and responding to child protection risks. So these are the 2 basic concepts that we're working on child protection in regular times, and we're using the same concepts and the same thinking also when we work with child protection in emergencies. So what does this mean then for the disaster risk reduction? Well, when I and Eric have discussed this together and with other colleagues, we think that one entry point to see DRR as an added value to our child protection work is to first look at how we target. How do we find the areas and the population groups that we want to work with? Eric has already given some examples of different combinations of indicators you can put together in order to make sure that you're doing your targeting as most effective and strategic as possible. If we're looking at this from a child protection angle, we think that these could be the different groups of indicators that could be put together to guide us to look at how we can most effectively work on DRR and child protection. We could look at indicators that indicates where the climate changes are happening, or which areas are the most vulnerable to climate change, where there are hazard risks and which hazard risks do we have. The indicators that show economic, social, and cultural vulnerabilities, conflict early warning indicators, indicators that shows the capacity or the lack of capacity to respond to child protection, which is the link to the child protection systems and their strengths and weaknesses, the access to state services, the existing child protection concerns that will probably become even stronger or exacerbated during the emergency, and the coping mechanisms among different communities, in particular if there are negative coping mechanisms, like, for example, the tendency to marry off girl at very early ages because you think that protects them. So by putting these indicators in these different areas together, that might help us to then focus our child protection work in a more effective way, which would be step 2. On the next slide, please. The next step would then be to look at what kind of activities do we do with these in these areas and with these groups of population that we have identified. And this is still, of course, very much work in progress. But some of that will be just a regular development work. For example, strengthening the system, the child protection system, in the way that we always do, but in this case, focusing on this specific geographical area. But it can also be to strengthen the particular relevant components of the child protection system that needs to be working and needs to respond in an emergency. It can be to work towards preventing separation between children and families, or to activities that strengthen children's and families' resilience to emergencies. It can be to set up or strengthen community-based child protection mechanisms that may need to kick in to replace the formal system in the case that an emergency has affected the formal system so that they cannot, or there is a gap in their capacity to provide response as usual. And it can also be inclusion of child protection in preparedness plans. So these, of course, are just some very few ideas we have of activities that could be done as a part of the disaster risk reduction and child protection. And this list can be made much, much longer. Next slide, please. And that's why we would like to hear from you now. What are your thoughts of DRR and child protection? What is the added value of combining these two concepts? What are the examples from your own experience of working with emergencies and disaster risk reduction? What are the difficulties and obstacles in this work, and what are the opportunities? So both I and Eric are very eagerly awaiting your response and your thoughts about this, and we thank you very much for the attention if you made it this far in the presentation.